Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thanks for coming out in the rain, and welcome to Ann Arbor District Library. My name is Kathleen, and I'll be your host this evening. We ask that all cell phones be silenced for this evening. No vibrating either, if we could. There are hearing assistant devices in the back. If you need one of those, if you just walk back there, someone can help you out with it. The restrooms are out of this room where you came in and to the right, all the way in to stay to your right, and they're kind of in the back corner if you need the restrooms. They're not labeled super well, so just kind of hug that right wall to the back. So tonight, I am going to introduce Randy Schwartz from the Culinary Historians of Ann Arbor, and he is going to further introduce your guest speaker this evening.
Thank you, Kathleen. And thanks to you folks for coming out here today for today's talk by Allyson Pérez on Miami Cuban restaurant culture. And I want to give a special welcome to all the folks online, too. So a big shout out, for example, to Doris in Fishkill, New York, to Lucia in Miami, Florida, to Odalise, who's with the Smithsonian History Museum in Washington, the nation's capital. Hello also to Lauren in Los Angeles, California, where it's 3 o'clock now. And to all the others who are watching now with us. Welcome to everyone. I also want to thank our host for today's program, the Ann Arbor District Library. They provide us this presentation space as well as promotional and technical support so we can share these programs far and wide by live streaming them and by recording and posting them on the library's YouTube channel. I'm Randy Schwartz from the Culinary Historians of Ann Arbor. For the new viewers and visitors today, I'd like to briefly introduce you to CHAA. We're an informal group bringing together all sorts of people interested in the history and culture of food and cooking. We were founded in 1983, and new members are always welcome. We have about 150 members currently, around half of them in Michigan, the other half across North America and overseas. Besides these monthly talks, we also have twice yearly participatory theme meals for members only. Our theme meal next June will celebrate Juneteenth and the foods of African Americans in that century. If you're not a member of CHAA, we'd love to have you join us. Membership is only $25 a year for an individual or for a couple, and it includes a subscription to our quarterly magazine, Repast. A postal subscription to Repast by itself is only $20 a year, no matter what country you happen to live in. By the way, if you'd like to write something for Repast, or to give one of these talks for that matter, just contact us using the CHAA website, culinaryhistoriansannarbor.org, and we'll talk over some ideas. If you'd like to join our group or just to subscribe to Repast, you can find the information on that website. Click on the membership tab there. You can also follow us on Facebook. Just search for Culinary Historians of Ann Arbor. Or if you're here in person, you can pick up a membership form, one of the blue forms on the side table, after the question and answer session. And by the way, for those watching this online via YouTube, if you'd like to ask the speaker a question, you can type it into the chat section of YouTube, and we'll try to convey that to the speaker. After the Q&A today, for those here in person, we have some treats for you to taste. We tried to make the classic Cuban dish of black beans stewed with rice, which is called Moros y Cristianos, or Moors and Christians, because of the black and white ingredients. The Cuban American version of the pastry we made with guava paste and cream cheese called pastelitos de guayaba, and some coffee, hot coffee, or caliente, as they say in Cuba. So help yourselves to those snacks after the program. Now, this is our final talk of the school year, but we have the Juneteenth celebration meal in June, and then we're looking ahead to our 3 talks in the fall. In September, Dr. Mark Johnson, is coming up here from Chattanooga, Tennessee, to speak about his new book on the history of bacon in America. Everyone loves bacon. In October, Dr. Ashley Young of the Smithsonian Museum will speak on the history of street food in New Orleans. And in November, a pair of speakers, Dr. Adrian Miller and the University of Michigan alumna Deborah Chang, will speak on the history of White House chefs of Asian heritage. There's a whole book they've written just on that topic, Asian American White House chefs. But now, finally, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Allyson Rose Pérez. She's a third-year Ph.D. student and graduate student instructor in the Department of American Culture here at the University of Michigan. Born in Miami and raised mostly in Raleigh, North Carolina, she completed a bachelor's degree in social studies at Harvard in 2017 and a master's in gastronomy at the University of Gastronomic Sciences in Pollenzo, Italy in 2018. Following that, she relocated to Washington, D.C. to work on Capitol Hill as a graduate fellow in nutritional health, affiliated with the Congressional Hispanic Caucus and the office of Representative Kim Schreier of Washington State. And then from 2020 to 2023, she worked as a policy analyst on child nutrition with the Food Research and Action Center in Washington. The research she's doing now at the university, which she'll talk to us about today, focuses on the history of Cuban restaurants in Miami as community centers among the immigrants. So please join me in welcoming Allyson Pérez.
Can everyone hear me? Yes. Great, excellent. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for being here, whether you're here in person with us or you're here virtually on YouTube. My name is Allyson Pérez, and I'm a third-year Ph.D. candidate in the Department of American Culture at the University of Michigan. I want to start by thanking Randy and everyone at the Culinary Historians of Ann Arbor for inviting me to speak tonight, and for the delicious food that we're about to enjoy afterwards. I was really humbled and flattered by your invitation, and I couldn't be more excited to share some of my research with you all today. I'd also like to thank the kind people of the Ann Arbor District Library's downtown branch for all their technical and logistical support tonight, which makes everything that you're seeing possible. I'd like to take a moment as well to thank my wonderful committee, including my chair, Lawrence LaFountain Stokes, who is here with us tonight, include also Jessica Walker and Luciana Chamorro for all their support for my project, as well as our department chair, Magdalena Saborowska, our director of graduate studies, Susan Najida, and our graduate coordinator, Katia Kitchen, for their leadership and encouragement over the years. Thank you to my mentors, Ruth Behar and Silvia Pedraza, for all the care and advice that they've provided me throughout my time here at Michigan and providing the blueprint for scholarship of Cuba that I aspire to follow. I'd also like to express deep, deep gratitude for the University of Miami's Cuban Heritage Collection, where I spent last summer as a Goizueta Foundation graduate pre-prospectus fellow, and where many of the primary source documents I explore in this talk are housed. Finally, I want to thank my friends and loved ones, whether you're here or if you're tuning in online, for their love and support, which has sustained me during my time at Michigan and beyond. Despite making up less than 1% of the US population, Cuban Americans have had an outsized impact on the US economy, culture, and politics. Since Fidel Castro's 1959 revolution, well over 1 million Cubans have migrated to the United States, where they've been welcomed with open arms, thanks to favorable immigration policies and access to a number of social programs that have allowed them to establish roots. Despite initial attempts by the US government to spread out these Cuban refugees across the country, a good number of these Cuban immigrants ended up settling in Miami, Florida, which is the community I'll focus on during this talk. In the decades that have passed, Cubans have reshaped South Florida in their own image, establishing businesses, taking over local and state politics, and turning Miami into an economic bridge between the United States and Latin America. But instead of focusing on corporations or political action committees or even politicians, I'd like to focus on another beloved set of Miami institutions that have played an integral role in the Cubans' rise as any other: restaurants. My goal today is to demonstrate how, by looking at restaurants, we can more deeply understand the history and evolution of South Florida's Cuban immigrant community and how it's risen to prominence, going from a community of people fleeing a volatile political environment to a dominating cultural, economic, and political force that has turned Miami from a sleepy tourism destination to a booming metropolis. To understand the different constituent parts of the story, I ask 3 questions, which I'll answer over the course of this talk. They are as follows. What can restaurants tell us about immigrant communities? Next, what relevance do food and restaurants have in Cuban history? And finally, how can we trace this history from the early 20th century Cuba to the Miami of the late 20th century, particularly post-1959? I'll first start by giving an overview of what we know from academic literature on the importance of food and restaurants in immigrant communities and the origins of Cuban food culture, rounding out with an exploration of some primary source documents that tell us more about Miami's restaurant scene. Throughout the history of the United States, restaurants have played a key role in immigrant communities, first and foremost as the main industry in which immigrants are employed. As Krishnendu Ray notes in The Ethnic Restaurateur, since the US Census began collecting data related to occupation and birthplace in 1850, data has shown a strong correlation between food service occupations and new immigrant groups. In fact, across 1850, 1900, and 1950 censuses, the foreign-born numerically dominate certain occupations, such as domestic servants, hotel and restaurant employees, hotel keepers, saloon keepers and bartenders, traders and dealers in groceries, bakers and butchers, even as, over time, the origin of these immigrant hospitality workers has changed to reflect the migration patterns of a given time period. This trend continues into the 21st century, as in the 2000 census, 75% of New York City's restaurant cooks and 64% of its restaurant workers overall were made up of foreign-born immigrants, the majority of whom are from Latin America. Throughout US history, ethnic enclaves have played a major role in immigrant lives and livelihoods, and often house the restaurants where immigrants are employed. As discussed by Alejandro Portes and Robert D. Manning, immigrant neighborhoods often become hubs of entrepreneurship, or ethnic enclaves, concentrated areas where immigrant communities build and maintain successful businesses, patronized by their communities thanks to the expertise of community members with business experience, access to pooled capital, and an available immigrant workforce. These enclaves have historically housed a high number of food-related businesses, including restaurants, saloons, and grocers, relying on a co-ethnic clientele, searching for familiar tastes of home, as well as co-ethnic employees in order to run successfully, as we see in Donna Gabacha's We Are What We Eat. Interactions between immigrant business owners, customers, and laborers in these enclave businesses reinforce close ties among these groups, leading many of their enclave businesses to become informal community centers. Through these informal community centers, immigrants in the enclave reap myriad benefits, as emphasized by Natalia Molina in A Place at the Nayarit. Molina writes, "The restaurant provided immigrant workers and customers with the familiarity of home and a ready-made social network, offering local history, introductions, and information about how to navigate the system, all invaluable assets for newcomers attempting to negotiate a large, daunting foreign city. The resources and networks available there allowed working people to assume full identities that went beyond who they were as laborers. At the restaurant, immigrants might not feel any more American, nor was that necessarily their goal, but they were insiders. Meredith Abarca's Charlas Culinarias further demonstrates that, in addition to staffing customers, immigrant restaurant owners benefit beyond traditional profit margins through what she calls familial wealth that allows them and their families to make a foothold in the United States. For their communities, however, these restaurants become public kitchens, which provide an extended home, becomes a community center and a meeting hall for fellow immigrants to socialize, celebrate their shared culture, and even discuss politics. Since the beginning of Cuba's struggle for independence in the latter half of the 19th century, food and restaurants have played an important role for Cubans both on the island and living in the United States. As highlighted by Allyson Pérez Jr. in Rice in the Time of Sugar, the idea of a Cuban national cuisine emerged in the early 19th century, allowing Cubans, by claiming shared tastes in particular foods, to assert a unified nationality and national sovereignty in search of independence. Something that emerges out of this 19th century project of defining Cuban food is the centrality of rice, which Pérez argues is more than a food. It's a way of life, an obligatory presence on the Cuban table, which became evident in the cookbooks and literature during that time period. Throughout the struggle for independence, Cubans made their way to Tampa, Florida, and New York City, where Pérez notes they transformed their new homes in their image, often by opening food businesses. And on becoming Cuban, Pérez highlights that the Cuban diasporic newspaper Patria's roster of Cuban advertisers in New York between 1892 and 1895 listed 5 bodegas and 4 restaurants. By the 1920s, Jorge Duani notes that Cuban, Puerto Rican, and other quote-unquote Spanish restaurants proliferated in Manhattan's Upper West Side and East Harlem neighborhoods. As turn of the 20th century Cubans made their way back and forth between enclaves in Tampa and New York back to Havana, they brought a number of US influences with them, which continued to have an influence on Cuban national culture. In addition to an affinity for baseball, a sport Cubans would eventually come to dominate, they also brought back tastes for US foods. This can be seen through Cuba's most famous dish, the Cuban sandwich, which Hughes, Cruz, and Houck uncover in The Cuban Sandwich, A History in Layers. According to the authors, the Cuban sandwich emerges in Havana at the turn of the 20th century, around the time of Cuba's independence, and reflects the fashions and traditions of their former Spanish colonizer and their newest imperial influence, the United States. Bread, alongside the wheat flour needed to bake it, was brought to Cuba by the Spanish as a civilizing effort. And by the time of independence, cold cuts of various kinds were to be found all over the lunch counters and cafes of Cuba's major cities, influenced by Cuban exposure to Spanish and US tastes. The final touches, the Swiss cheese, mustard, and pickles, contrary to popular mythologizing around the mixture of Cuban, Italian, and Jewish immigrants in Florida's west coast city of Tampa, can be derived to early 20th century culinary fashion in New York City, where these toppings were very common on sandwiches. Nearly simultaneously, as the sandwich was becoming popular on the island, it made its way to Cuban enclaves in Tampa, Key West, and New York, where, alongside US tourists who were visiting the island, it became a massive hit, thus beginning the international love affair with the Cubano. As the authors succinctly describe it, it is there, in the oscillation of Cubans between the homeland they inherited and the one they invented abroad, where we can identify, if not the origins of the Cuban sandwich, then the era and landscape in which it flourished. This relationship of exchange between the United States and Cuba would only continue over the course of the first half of the 20th century. Cuba, and particularly Havana, became a favored tourism destination by US travelers of all kinds, from the rich and famous to the middle class. I'm sure many of you are familiar with tales of Havana glitz and glamour, with its casinos and nightclubs, and perhaps recall the popularity of Cuban musical forms like the mambo and the cha-cha-cha from the 40s and the 50s. But before people would head to popular nightclubs like Tropicana, El Gran Casino Nacional, and Montmartre, they would have something to eat at any number of Havana's chic restaurants. In this Havana Weekly booklet from December 1948, the Cuban Tourism Commission provided tourists visiting town a host of recommendations on things to do, places to stay, and helpful tips and advice on local culture and customs. Anyone accustomed to modern travel knows how valuable restaurant recommendations are, but rather than Yelp or TripAdvisor, tourists in the 40s had Havana Weekly. The commission recommended 17 restaurants to visiting readers, and in addition to these restaurants, included a number of paid restaurant advertisements. In fact, of the 25 paid advertisements included in the booklet, the business category with the highest number of entries were restaurants, with 7 advertisements. The next highest category was airlines, with 3. A night out to eat was as much of an event as a night out at the Tropicana, as well as evident from the wealth of souvenir photos taken at various Havana restaurants found in the Cuban Heritage Collection. There's a lot of information that we can gather from these 17 souvenir photographs I found, so I'll start by doing a little bit of visual and textual analysis. The first thing that you notice about the photographs is that they're each contained in a cardboard souvenir sleeve. They're all roughly about the same size, about 7 by 9 inches, with the front of the sleeve giving the name of the restaurant, the address, the phone number, and often other information to draw in customers, such as the restaurant's specialty dishes or that they have air conditioning, which in Havana is a must. Often, the owner or manager's name is listed on the front of the sleeve as well. On the back of the sleeve, it's common to find the photographer's stamp with office addresses and phone numbers. Let's take a closer look at one of these sleeves so we can see what I'm talking about. On this sleeve, for Bahia restaurant, we have a stylized border with flowers, with the name of the restaurant below, announcing Photo Souvenir de Bahia restaurant. On the left, we see a drawing of a waiter carrying a covered tray of food with steam wafting around him. And on the right, a man in front of a microphone with sound rays emitting from it. Images that indicate that you can not only expect to eat well here, but to enjoy entertainment of some kind while you eat. Below the restaurant name, we have the names of specialty dishes, first in Spanish and then in rudimentary English, indicated that they want to attract both a local and a tourist clientele. Exclusivos become especial foods, while filete único becomes filet unique, and mariscos valenciana become seafood Valencian. At the bottom, the restaurant's address and phone number at Avenida de Puerto y Justiz, indicating the intersection where the restaurant was located in Old Havana, at the mouth of the port of Havana, a stone's throw from the colonial Plaza de Armas. On the reverse, we see a stamp for Photo Mike, whose offices are just a 5-minute walk down the road in Old Havana at the intersection of Muralla and Oficio. Photo Mike's services were popular among Old Havana restaurants of the 1950s, as I found his stamp on souvenir photo sleeves of at least 3 different restaurants in the collection. Clearly then, the souvenir photos are part of a marketing strategy, not only for the restaurants, but also for the photographers that they hired to photograph their clientele, demonstrating a burgeoning restaurant and photography economy in the 1940s and 50s Havana. Opening up the sleeves, the photographs are either glued or stapled to the right side of the sleeve, whereas on the left side, the subjects contained in the photographs often signed their names, particularly common if the photographed party was a large group. Even if the photographs themselves were a marketing ploy for the restaurants, the moments pictured in these photographs were significant enough to those depicted that they wanted to memorialize the evening they spent in these spaces surrounded by the people they were pictured with. Turning our attention to the subjects of these photos, whether the groups are big or small, a group of male friends sharing a night out, or a large family gathering around a table, it's clear from facial expressions that whatever moment was being shared was disrupted by the photographer's presence. Many are smiling at the camera, just as many are mid-sentence or mid-bite, staring into the camera in recognition of this interruption. On a more serious note, it's clear from the way people are dressed, how the tables are set with white tablecloths and cloth napkins, that eating at one of these restaurants was a special occasion, one where people wanted to look their best, lest a photographer capture their presence. Obviously, there's a spectrum dressing up and documented in these photos, from what one could consider business casual, as we can see here or here, to ball gowns and tuxedos, as we can see here, which it also indicates class differences between the types of patrons who would eat at El Templete, pictured in this photo, or Rancho Luna, pictured here, and San Souci, which is pictured in this photograph. Notably, it's also interesting to see the photograph surroundings of the restaurant as well. In two of these photographs, we can see musicians in the background, playing instruments, a testament to the spectacle of a night out to eat, as evidenced from the souvenir sleeves logos, for example. And in each photograph, whether there's food on the table or not, there are beverages aplenty. As I said before, many of these photographs included in the collection were signed and dated by those photographed, further underscoring that these nights out to eat were special occasions to be savored, treasured, and remembered. In the aftermath of Fidel Castro's 1959 revolution, as property and businesses were being nationalized by the government and relations with the United States began to sour, thousands of Cubans decided to leave Cuba for the United States. As initial hopes that the revolution would blow over and they'd be able to soon return were dashed by the failed 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion and the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, Cuban exiles began to more seriously root themselves in South Florida, following their independence-era predecessors by establishing a Cuban enclave of businesses in Miami. As noted by Alejandro Portes and Kenneth Wilson, between 1967 and 1976, the number of Cuban-owned businesses in Miami increased by over 700%, from 919 businesses in 1967 to around 8,000 in 1976. While the nature and size of these businesses varied, Portes and Wilson briefly note that smaller entrepreneurs tended to favor restaurants as business ventures, as evidenced in the data from the time period. The enclave economy provided opportunities for Cubans to maintain their culture and meet a number of their needs within their own community, often without even having to learn English or assimilate to US cultural norms, thanks to businesses that catered to Cuban customs and sensibilities. The restaurants that Cuban immigrants opened in their Miami enclave drew upon the established grammar of restaurant culture in Havana that their exiled customers were already familiar with. In fact, even some of the restaurants themselves were restaurants customers were already familiar with, since many of them were Havana restaurants that had reopened in Miami by the original owners and staff after the Cuban government nationalized the original Havana locations and continued running them under government supervision. Two of the most famous cases I found in the archive are El Floridita and La Bodeguita del Medio, both legendary Havana bar/restaurants whose fates were split in two in the aftermath of the revolution. I'll take a bit of time to talk about each of them. Restaurant bar La Florida was first opened, according to this souvenir cocktail recipe book dating to the 1920s, on Calle Obispo at the intersection with Calle Montserrat in Old Havana in 1819 under the name La Piña de Plata, or the silver pineapple. Today, the bar stands in the exact same location in Old Havana as it did over 2 centuries ago, although now official claims state that it first opened in 1817. It was rechristened Restaurant Bar La Florida about a century later due to customer preferences. And as we can see in this 1930 photograph of the restaurant facade, it was no longer called the Silver Pineapple. By 1917, the bar was taken over by Constante, a Catalan immigrant who started working at Floridita as a bartender and worked his way up the ranks. He's credited with inventing the frozen daiquiri, the drink that would make Floridita famous. As we see in this 1930 advertisement, the restaurant advertised itself as the creator of the daiquiri cocktail and seems to have linked itself to the tale of Juan Ponce de Leon, famous Spanish explorer known for his search for the Fountain of Youth in what is now the U.S. state of Florida. Although according to this advertisement, he was looking in the wrong Florida. It had been in Havana all along, in the form of a daiquiri. Perhaps this imagery, linking Havana and Florida, was more prescient than the ad's designer had originally intended, as we shall see as this story plays out over the course of the revolution. By the 1930s, Floridita was already famous among locals and international visitors for its seafood and its cocktails. But the patron that really put the place on the map was the famous US novelist and Cubophile, Ernest Hemingway, pictured here at the bar, sipping a drink prepared by Constante himself. Hemingway was a regular at Floridita, although he was also known to split his time between Floridita and another bar across town, as famously documented on this handwritten note scrawled on a napkin: "My mojito en la bodeguita, and my daiquiri en el Floridita." I now have a little Easter egg for any Cubans who are in the audience, maybe those who are watching virtually. This postcard displays an etching of a very famous location in Havana that is proudly displayed in nearly every Cuban household in Miami that I've entered. However, something is missing. Can anybody guess what it is and why that might be? This is the cathedral. For context clues, I'm sure you already know the answer, and I'm not technically savvy enough to see if anyone online has guessed correctly, so I'll just go ahead and tell you. This is the intersection of Empedrado and San Ignacio streets, just off of the Plaza de la Catedral in La Habana Vieja, where you'll likely recognize from this painting, seen in various versions across diasporic Cuban households the world over, as well as many tourist souvenirs. The reason why you may not have recognized the postcard is because the postcard dates back to 1910, several decades before La Bodeguita existed. La Bodeguita en Medio was opened in 1942 by a man named Ángel Martínez as Casa Martínez. It was also a favorite haunt of famous Afro-Cuban poet Nicolás Guillén, who also immortalized La Bodeguita in his poetry. Enter Fidel Castro and the revolution. While the initial targets of the revolution's efforts to nationalize private businesses were properties owned by multinational corporations and major factories and enterprises, over the course of the 1960s, the revolution decided to also privatize small businesses of all kinds, from laundromats to butchers and grocers, and of course, bars and restaurants, culminating in the Ofensivo Revolucionario, or the Revolutionary Offensive of 1968, which finished the nationalization of all small businesses across the country. Many of the business owners whose properties were nationalized decided to flee the country on freedom flights to the United States, which referred to a series of daily flights from Havana to Miami that occurred between 1965 and 1973, bringing thousands of Cubans to Miami and fueling the burgeoning ethnic enclave that was taking form there. Former owners and staff of both La Floridita and La Bodeguita were among those who came to Miami, where they reopened both establishments in exile. However, this created a fascinating dynamic across the Florida Strait, as the original restaurants remained open in Havana. While many small businesses nationalized in the 1960s were closed for good, a fascinating dynamic that played out in the restaurant industry in particular was the Cuban government's decision to keep the names, the decor, and the recipes of the original restaurants as they were before the revolution, due to their popularity among tourists and the opportunity this provided to contribute to the coffers of the revolution's more populist policy efforts. As original owners set up these restaurants in exile in Miami, however, they pushed narratives of authenticity about the reestablished locations relative to those now operated by the Cuban government in Havana, hoping to reattract their Havana clientele that had moved with them to Miami, not only on pure nostalgic grounds, but also political grounds, criticizing the revolution. In a way, you could say that the newly opened Miami locations were serving their home-style meals and signature cocktails with the side of politics to their dissident clientele. Here, we have an informational pamphlet advertising the Floridita's Miami location at 145 East Flagler Street in the heart of downtown Miami. The front of the pamphlet advertises the original daiquiri in Miami and declares itself una institución de integridad única, an institution of unique integrity, made for the enjoyment of good company, good food, and the legitimate Cuban daiquiri. On the inside, we have comparisons of the original Havana location and the newly established Miami location. I'll translate some of the copy. Yesterday, in cheerful and boisterous Havana. Today, in Miami, with the flavor of Cuban tradition. And again, an institution of unique integrity resurges in Miami. On the top panel, this traditional environment took the path of exile, leaving behind only a name full of memories. On the bottom, today, Floridita reemerges at Avenue Phoenix in Puerta de las Americas, in the financial and commercial heart of the touristic city of Miami. Its mysteries and traditional environment from yesteryear makes it resurge as a meeting place for local and worldly personages, politicians, businessmen, men of arts and letters, to enjoy the same good company, good food, the most delicate cocktails, and the authentic Cuban daiquiri. The rebirth of a unique experience that you deserve to enjoy. The Miami Floridita shores up its bona fides on the next page, ensuring its clientele that the men in charge of Floridita in exile are some of the same faces that they remember from Havana, as Antonio Meilán and Ricardo Balbidia, pictured in Havana on the left and in Miami on the right, got their start as cantineros or bartenders in Havana, pictured alongside the bust of Ernest Hemingway to remind customers of Floridita's former glory. These esteemed customers can rest assured that under the leadership of these seasoned hospitality veterans, their beloved daiquiris, as well as their famous seafood dishes, are in good hands. Beyond these claims of authenticity, Floridita in exile used other tried and true Havana tactics to attract customers. As we can see in this flyer, advertising live music and entertainment Wednesday through Saturday nights, as in Havana, where restaurant goers could enjoy their meals with live entertainment, as seen in the food souvenir photographs. Many Cuban restaurants in Miami would hire musicians to entertain their guests on weekends, hearkening back to the refined environments they remember from pre-revolutionary days. While Floridita made its home in downtown Miami, La Bodeguita de Medio was reopened in the heart of La Sabuesera, the southwest corridor of Miami, the segment of Miami most heavily populated by Cubans in the post-revolutionary years that included Little Havana, but also expanded beyond its reach. Opened by the relatives of Ángel Martínez, who fled Cuba in the 1960s, La Bodeguita in Miami took much more defiant tone towards the version of La Bodeguita that still existed in Havana, as well as the various locations opened across Latin America and Western Europe by the Cuban government to attract tourists to come to Cuba. This placemat menu from Miami's Bodeguita declares itself the original Bodeguita de Medio, founded by Martínez in 1942 in Old Havana, today in the heart of Miami, Florida, still under the administration of the Martinez family. On the left panel, a poem dedicated to La Bodeguita's founder, Ángel, reads as follows. Ángel, La Bodeguita remains your bodeguita even in Miami, as your descendants triumphantly keep tending to it. The world rightly boasts of it, and little Havana holds it up high. Without franchises or Guillén, it still belongs to the Martinezes. This is a shot at poet Nicolás Guillén, mentioned previously, who's decided to stay in Cuba after the revolution, and at the Cuban government for opening other franchise locations elsewhere. The Canary Islands one, the Mexico City and Puerto Vallarta ones, the French one, and whichever follow, are tricks of the tyrant to usurp our history and profit from your glory. For this reason, rest in peace, for we promise you that your bodeguita lives. The real one is in Miami, after the original founded in Havana by the great Ángel Martinez, as we know. When compared to the placemat menu of the Havana bodeguita, it becomes a little more evident the specific shots that the Miami Martinezes are taking. If this looks familiar, it's because the one I just showed you is designed to mimic this one, with a drawing of La Bodeguita in the center, crowned by Hemingway's famous My Mojito in La Bodeguita, flanked to the right by the food menu with similar items and descriptions as the Miami location, and flanked on the left by Nicolás Guillén's famous poem dedicated to La Bodeguita. In the parlance of the internet, the girls were fighting. By now, it's no secret that the original Floridita and Bodeguita locations remain open in Havana, and still to this day are popular destinations for tourists around the world, looking for Hemingway's favorite daiquiri and mojito, respectively. Unfortunately, neither of the Miami locations of these restaurants reopened in exile survived past the dawn of the 21st century, as was the case for many of the Havana restaurants, who reopened in exile by original owners and staff members, such as Rancho Luna in Havana's Huajay district or Centro Vaco of Belvedado. However, these are not the only Cuban restaurants that sprung out of Miami's Cuban enclave of the 60s, 70s, and beyond. As the most successful enclave restaurants were newly established restaurants, albeit that many were opened by families with long-standing restaurant experience in Cuba, even if they did not attempt to open the exact same restaurants in Miami. Even as these new restaurants were established, however, they continue the legacy of the Havana restaurant culture their owners and clientele remembered. Restaurants like El Tropical restaurant in Hialeah advertised a refined environment with live music on weekends. Following the long Havana tradition of white tablecloths and entertainment as diners enjoyed their meals. In this advertisement that we see over on the right, they don't really talk much about their food. Most of the advertisement is actually about the live entertainment. Versailles on Southwest 8th Street, or Calle Ocho, in Little Havana, captured Havana's elegance and hearkening towards US and European cosmopolitanism through its name and its decor, even as they served home-style Cuban dishes to their clientele. Across Miami, a number of original Cuban restaurants proliferated throughout the 1970s and 80s, selling Cuban meals not only on fancy place settings, but also in more casual environments, appealing to a burgeoning middle class of Cubans who could eat out, not only for special occasions, but whenever they wanted a quick meal of Cuban-style fast food. A Cuban sandwich, a pan con bistec or steak sandwich, or a frita cubana, the beloved Cuban hamburger invented on the streets of Havana in the 1920s, consisting of a chorizo-style patty topped with potato sticks on a Cuban bread bun, which Ann Arborites may be familiar with if they've ever been to Frita Batidos on West Washington Street. Some of these beloved places, like Sergio's and Latin American, known for their Cuban-style steak sandwiches, and El Rey de las Fritas, and El Mago de las Fritas, and Morro Castle, known for their fritas. As the years have gone by, individual Cuban restaurants have come and go from Miami's landscape. But what remains, across waves of migration from Cuba, and even as Cuban immigrants had children and grandchildren, is the popularity of these restaurants as spaces where Cuban immigrants can get their first jobs, can make their way in South Florida's economy, as well as spaces where culinary memory is preserved for future generations. Often, this involves politics. As anyone familiar with Miami's Ventanita scene will tell you, as it is ubiquitous across Miami's Cuban coffee windows that there will inevitably be a group of viejitos talking about the latest news from Havana and Washington, D.C. Versailles and its Ventanita in Little Havana have pride of place as a hub for political expression in Cuban Miami, as covered by the New York Times back in 2021. Whenever anything of significance in Cuban politics happens, you can be guaranteed that a group of demonstrators will show up with signs and Cuban flags outside of Versailles to celebrate or to protest, as they did in 2016 when Fidel Castro passed away, or in 2021 in solidarity with protesters across the island, calling on the government to relieve its citizens of the economic downturn precipitated by the COVID-19 pandemic. I hope that this presentation was at least informative and provided you with some new perspectives on what restaurants can tell us not only about Cuban immigrants, but an example of what these spaces mean to immigrant communities regardless of their origin, and what these restaurants tell us about the histories and cultures immigrants bring with them to the United States. I also, before closing, want to thank the Cuban Heritage Collection again for their support in allowing me to study these materials for my research. Thank you all for your time, and I'll open up the floor for questions.
If you have a question, please, Kathleen will bring the microphone for you so the online audience can hear.
Thank you for your presentation. It was really great.
Thank you.
I was curious, in terms of your research, thinking about like the experience of like being in the restaurant, or you spoke a little bit about like workers in the restaurant and how that's a community space. Do you anticipate integrating like any oral histories or like stories of like being in the restaurant or anything like that?
Yes. The rest of my dissertation will be focused on being in the restaurant.
So cool.
I see myself as primarily an ethnographer. What we've seen today is chunks of what will turn into my first dissertation chapter, which provides sort of the historical context, but the rest of the dissertation will mostly be an ethnography that will take place in restaurants.
Oh, thank you so much for your presentation. You've made us so hungry. So I'm wondering if you have any personal stories about restaurants that you'd like to share with us. But I also just wanted to share that while watching your presentation and your images, I noticed that several restaurants announced drag queens as part of their entertainment.
Not tell us was that the nightclub, which was the premier nighttime destination in Pinar del Rio, Cuba, was a drag club, and that the performers were all drag performers. And my parents, the way that you fell out of your chair, my parents also similarly fell out of their chairs. We had a great time. This is very deeply enmeshed into Cuban nightlife culture. I have an acquaintance on the internet. Her name is Librada. She has an Instagram account called Cubana Queer that explores the history of Cuban drag queens or transformistas and also Cuban queer performers and trans women. Her content is incredible. I think it is definitely something that I would love to explore more and see how much that is happening now in the United States and in Miami, as so many Cubans, as we've talked about, have come to the United States in the past 5 years. And obviously Carrie has done a lot of research on what the trans community and the drag community in Cuba looks like. Yeah, I think that is an absolutely fascinating aspect of Cuban restaurant culture that I don't think has been explored very well, and I look forward to seeing how it shows up in Miami. But I think, to answer your first question, I think restaurants are sort of just part of the fabric of my family's story. Some of the only photographs that I have of my father's side of the family are, well, this is the only photograph really that I have of my dad's entire family from Cuba, and it was taken at Rancho Luna in the late 1950s. These are my grandparents right here. Both of my grandmothers' first jobs in the United States were as restaurant workers. This grandmother was a waitress at a diner, and my other grandmother was a cashier at a lunch counter. And that grandmother ended up working in restaurants for 40 plus years. Restaurants are where we celebrated every family occasion. My father was also a cook and a graduate of hotel and restaurant management from Florida International University. So it just permeates everything about my life, and that's what's drawn me to this type of research.
Hi, Allyson, over here. Thank you so much for your presentation and for sharing this wonderful work and your personal connection. It's very compelling, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah. So my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that post-revolution, the economic blockade made many ingredients difficult for the cuisine sort of to perpetuate itself in the same way pre-revolution in Cuba. And I was really struck by the political messaging of the advertisements in Miami. And so I just wondered if in your research you saw any evidence of folks responding to the changing reality of how the cuisines in Cuba and in Miami were sort of becoming more different from each other over time.
Absolutely. I think this is another really fascinating dynamic that as time has gone on has become even more stark, the differences between what I grew up eating, for example, and recognizing as Cuban food, and what my cousins who are living in Cuba think about and recognize as Cuban food. For one, in the United States, we have access to beef in ways that Cubans, by and large, do not, unless they're working alongside the tourism industry and can sometimes have access to it. Another thing that we have access to in the United States that Cubans don't is potatoes. Potatoes do not grow in Cuba. So all of the French fries, all of the little potato sticks that we grew up eating on our sandwiches don't exist in Cuba. I think over the course of the past 10 years, as austerity and scarcity have really grown on the island, these differences are becoming even more stark. I had a friend and colleague whose family is actually the family that owned Rancho Luna, who was from my master's program, who wrote his undergraduate thesis about the difference of Cuban immigrants coming from Cuba to Miami and seeing all of the abundance that they have access to. He was using survey data. I think in my ethnographic work, I'm really interested in this question of what does it mean to be Cuban, and how do people understand what it means to be Cuban based off of their lived experiences, and particularly for those who are just coming to the United States now. There's a huge culture shock of oh, these people call themselves Cuban, but they don't look anything like what I recognize. So I think it's definitely also an opportunity to continue to do that type of work that I'm looking forward to do in the ethnographic component of my dissertation. So.
Other questions? Okay.
You said that beef is not common at all in Cuba. What meats are common? Any meats?
Yeah, so I think
chicken? I don't know.
chicken and beef, or rather, chicken and pork are a lot more common. Pork is sort of If there were no pork, there would be no Cuba, honestly. Not that Cubans have a lot of access to pork nowadays. They have more access to chicken. And a lot of that chicken actually does come from the United States. The U.S. is not, the trade embargo bars the United States from purchasing Cuban products, but very conveniently it does not bar Cuba from purchasing U.S. products. And so a lot of the rice and the chicken that are eaten in Cuba actually come from the United States.
Hi. Oh, I was just curious what your research looked like when you're in Miami. So I saw that you were at University of Miami in the
Sure.
Heritage Collection. Are you also going into restaurants and local
Yeah.
areas? And I'm just curious to hear more about that.
Sure. So last summer, I was in a library freezing my butt off in 95-degree heat because they kept the archive at like 65 degrees. But I am going to continue to do a little bit more archival work for my dissertation, but mostly what I'm going to be doing is going into restaurants and interacting with people, both on the staff side and the customer side, sort of trying to get an understanding of how people understand their identities, how they understand their place in this like Cuban Miami ecosystem, and also like how, from a labor's perspective, staff relate to customers who may not necessarily have these same understandings of what being Cuban is. So.
Didn't you say there's a Cuban restaurant on West Washington Street? Is it a Cuban restaurant, or they just have some Cuban food mixed in, or?
So Frita Batidos is a very popular restaurant among the University of Michigan students and a lot of Ann Arborites. It's they call themselves Cuban inspired, not necessarily Cuban. And if you have their regular frita, you will see what they mean, because it is just a hamburger with French fries on top. But they do have a pork patty that is inspired and tastes a lot like an actual frita that you would get in Miami. And they employ a lot of Cuban immigrant workers. So it is certainly a place to check out. Unfortunately, there was a great full-service Cuban restaurant in Ypsilanti that closed a couple of years ago that we can no longer enjoy. Shout out to Latin American Cuban cuisine. We miss you.
Where's the one on Washington? Is it on the other side of Main Street? Is it West Washington?
Yes, so it's at the intersection of Washington and Main Street.
Across the street from Cafe Zola. Next to Sweetwater.
A batido is a milkshake. So they also have tropical fruit milkshakes that are very delicious and very thick, hard to sip through a straw.
So just thinking about your ethnographic work and like what you have planned, do you anticipate thinking about like the intergenerational elements? Like you've already talked about like the family elements, and like, are you thinking it's, you're learning about Cuban identity now versus then, or like, I'm just curious to, I'm sure you have like a whole plan, kind
Sure.
of want to hear about it.
It is definitely something that I'm interested in. I think what I'm most interested in is seeing how more recent Cuban immigrants make their way in this very changing Miami. But inevitably that is also going to come up, because like as a third generation Cuban myself, or Cuban American, I suppose, this like, I want to say, I don't know any of the statistics, actually. I'm not going to pretend that I'm not going to say any numbers, but a good portion of Miami-Dade County has at least one descendant of Cuban origin. So it's certainly going to come up in research.
I have a couple questions online.
Great.
Thank you for the really interesting presentation. I have two questions.
Okay.
Number one, the
I have two
advertisement
answers.
postcard you showed toward the beginning of the presentation featured both white patrons and white staff. How do Cuban restaurants, both in Cuba and in the U.S., reflect racial issues, divisions within their structure and culture?
A fascinating question. I think I cannot speak to as much historically although it very much lines up with what one would assume of what it was like to be in Cuba at a time when it was very much tied to the U.S. economy and also U.S. social mores. What bears out in the academic literature of the past 20 years, as the private tourism sector has sort of proliferated and boomed in Cuba, is that a lot of the businesses that are tourist facing in Cuba, that are smaller businesses, are owned by Cubans that have family members in the United States who are sending them money and supplies to run these businesses. And because of the nature of Cuba's migration, a lot of those are white Cubans. And a lot of these places will also, and also the tourism industry in Cuba, the official tourism industry in Cuba from the government will also attract more of a white staff base because they want to project more of a white origin, European origin face to the tourism industry, especially for European and American tourists who are coming. So there's a lot of really charged racial tensions that are happening and continue to happen on the island and in Miami as well. So it's a great question.
Number 2, the Italian American restaurant culture reflected a patriarchal structure with workers that were often family members. I wonder if Cuban restaurants in the U.S. had a similar or different dynamic.
Yes. A lot of it was very patriarchally dominated, and I can't speak too much to it because I haven't done the actual research. But a lot of these restaurants are run and operated by men, and they are maybe family businesses, but they are run by men and employ their families and other people, and they're certainly, as Alejandro Portes talks about in his very important article on ethnic enclaves, people who are working in ethnic restaurants are not always fairly compensated in wages, but that's made up for, in theory, by access to job training, access to shared pools of capital, access to opportunities to move up the ladder within organizations or to start their own businesses. So it's complicated, but the short answer is there are very similar mechanisms happening in this community as well.
Any more questions out here? Okay, it looks like that's all for online.
Would you like to say something?
Sure.
Here, let me give you the microphone.
The Cuban population in Miami does not look anything like the Cuban population in Cuba.
Yeah.
They're pretty much all white.
Yeah.
And in Cuba, I don't even see a racial definition there. It's all pretty blended. I like to think they're a third white, a third black, and a third mixed. I've spent a lot of time there. So that's just my impression of it. So if you recall when Elian Gonzalez floated ashore.
Oh, I remember.
Years ago, and at that same time, there was a couple that came ashore, not with him, but at the same time, a white woman and a black man, Cubans, and they went to Little Miami and tried to adapt, and the black man went back to Cuba.
Mm-hmm.
He said that was not accepted in Little Miami. So there's a definite difference between the two.
Sure.
The two stems of the Cuban.
Absolutely. If anybody is also interested in learning more about the history of racial dynamics in Cuba, Alejandro de la Fuente, who's a historian out of Harvard University, has a great book called A Nation for All that talks about specific, that one.
I also brought some literature about Cuba today and the blockade and how it's impacted people on that.
Yeah. So, a great book that has a lot of really good information about specifically how Afro-Cubans have been pushed to the margins in Cuban society historically.
Any other comments or questions?
Hello, thank you for your presentation today about your
Thank you
research.
for coming.
I am a student here who's Cuban American from Miami, so this
Yeah.
felt very at home. I just wanted to ask, while you're doing your research and you plan on doing a lot more work in person, right, within these different restaurants in Miami, how are you going about selecting which restaurants you want to examine, and just that kind of aspect of your research?
It's a great question. I think something that is really important to me is I'm not really interested in studying restaurants that cater to tourists. I'm more interested in studying restaurants that people within the community are going to and patronizing, that are owned by Cubans and are like run and patronized by Cubans. I think I'm also really interested in looking at a variety of other dynamics, like is it a sit-down place? Is it more casual? So I'm trying to get different types of restaurants in the mix, as well as like in different areas of the city, because like Little Havana is not really Little Havana anymore. If you're looking for an actual Little Havana, you need to go to Hialeah or somewhere in like Kendall or Sweetwater. So also getting some geographic diversity across the city as well. Thanks for that question.
Okay, I think that's it for this evening. Randy, do you have any last words?
No, just
Okay.
to thank people for coming
Yeah.
and help yourselves to some snacks and check out the literature.
Okay, thanks everybody for coming. Thanks everybody for coming
Thank you
online.
all.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you so much.